If you ever wanted to know how much kindness is really worth, don't ask a billionaire. Ask the person who has only one meal left. Charlotte Whitmore had spent her entire life surrounded by polished marble, private elevators, and people who stood the moment she entered a room. At 36, she owned one of the largest luxury hospitality companies in America, a name printed across hotel towers from Seattle to Miami, a woman whose signature could move millions of dollars before breakfast. Yet every compliment she received came wrapped in expectation, every smile carried a price, and every handshake felt rehearsed. Earlier that morning, she had asked a simple question during an executive meeting. If I walked into one of our hotels looking like I had nowhere to sleep, what would happen? The room had answered with confident smiles. Every executive promised compassion. Every regional manager insisted their employees treated every guest with dignity. Charlotte nodded politely, but something inside her refused to believe them. So she canceled every appointment, removed the diamond earrings she almost never took off, tied her blonde hair beneath a faded knit cap, slipped into an oversized thrift store coat, and left her chauffeured sedan 3 blocks away. By noon, she no longer looked like the woman featured on magazine covers. She looked like someone the city had forgotten. Her first stop was one of her own flagship hotels in downtown Chicago. The revolving doors welcomed businessmen in tailored suits without hesitation, but the security guard quietly stepped in front of her before she could reach the marble lobby. "Sorry, ma'am," he said without making eye contact. "Guests only." Charlotte smiled gently. "I was hoping to warm up for just a few minutes." The guard's expression barely changed. "There's a public library 4 blocks east." The doors closed before she could answer. Through the glass, she watched guests sipping coffee beneath crystal chandeliers, while soft piano music floated across the lobby she had personally designed. She stood there another moment, invisible despite owning every square foot behind those doors. She walked another mile through the cold afternoon, passing cafes where conversations paused just long enough to notice her worn coat before continuing as though she no longer existed. At a bakery, she quietly asked whether yesterday's bread might still be available. The cashier apologized without sounding sorry. At a convenience store, another customer tightened his grip on his shopping bag before stepping around her. No insults, no shouting, just silence. The kind that slowly convinces a person they no longer belong anywhere. By late afternoon, the wind had sharpened. The temperature kept falling, and the streets slowly filled with people rushing home. Charlotte sat beneath the narrow awning of a closed laundromat, pulling her coat tighter around herself. For the first time in years, hunger stopped being an abstract word buried inside charity reports. It became a dull ache beneath her ribs. Her stomach tightened. Her hands felt colder than she expected. Across the street, traffic rolled past without slowing. Hundreds of faces. Hundreds of opportunities for someone to notice. No one did. Charlotte lowered her eyes, wondering whether this experiment had already answered every question she had come to ask. She didn't know that somewhere only a few blocks away, a tired black single dad was walking toward her carrying the last hot meal he and his little girl planned to share that night. The city kept moving as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Buses sighed at every stop. Office workers hurried beneath scarves and wool coats. Delivery trucks rolled through intersections with quiet determination. Chicago had always been good at teaching people how to look past one another. Charlotte Whitmore remained beneath the laundromat awning, watching shoes instead of faces now. She noticed expensive leather boots stepping around puddles, construction boots carrying the weight of 12-hour shifts, bright sneakers splashing through melting patches of old snow. Hundreds of footsteps. Not one slowed down. Her fingers had become stiff from the cold. She slipped them deeper into the sleeves of her oversized coat, surprised by how quickly discomfort erased pride. She had imagined this day would expose the world. Instead, it was exposing her. She had spent years believing generosity could be measured through annual reports, charitable foundations, and carefully organized community events. Yet sitting alone on cracked concrete with an empty stomach felt completely different from approving another donation at a polished conference table. Across town, Darnell Price checked the clock on his aging delivery van. 5:43 in the evening. He smiled to himself. Lily would already be waiting by the apartment window, counting headlights like she always did whenever he worked late. She claimed she could recognize his old van before it even turned onto their block. Most evenings she was right. Darnell reached into the passenger seat and picked up a small paper bag that carried the warmth of fresh chicken noodle soup and a grilled cheese sandwich cut neatly in half. The neighborhood diner gave him an employee discount every Thursday. It was never much, but it meant he and Lily could end the week with something warm before payday arrived. He glanced at his nearly empty wallet. $11.42. Enough for gas tomorrow if nothing unexpected happened. Life had taught him not to complain about numbers he could still count. As he drove toward home, a flashing detour sign forced traffic away from his usual route. Darnell sighed softly and turned down unfamiliar side streets lined with aging brick buildings and shuttered storefronts. The detour added almost 15 minutes, but Lily had learned patience long before most children her age. She would probably be reading another library book while waiting. The thought made him smile. At the next red light, he noticed a little girl walking beside her grandmother, both carrying grocery bags that looked heavier than they should have been. Without thinking, Darnell rolled down his window and waved them across before the light changed. The grandmother nodded with quiet gratitude. No words were necessary. Simple kindness rarely asked for applause. A few blocks later, he parked outside the apartment building to pick up Lily before heading to the community center where they usually ate together after his shift. She climbed into the van wearing a bright yellow knit hat that made her smile seem even bigger. Her backpack nearly swallowed her tiny shoulders. "Did you bring the Thursday soup?" she asked hopefully. Darnell laughed. "I would never forget Thursday soup." Lily hugged the warm paper bag for a second before placing it carefully between them. "It still smells amazing," she whispered. They drove only another few minutes before another traffic jam slowed every car to a crawl near the old laundromat. Darnell looked through the windshield absent-mindedly. Then his eyes settled on a lone woman sitting quietly beneath the narrow awning. She was not asking anyone for money. She was not waving at passing cars. She simply sat there, shoulders trembling slightly against the evening wind, trying to make herself smaller than the cold surrounding her. Lily followed her father's gaze. Her cheerful expression faded into thoughtful silence. "Daddy," she asked softly, "do you think she has anybody waiting for her tonight?" Darnell did not answer right away. He left the engine running for another few seconds, watching the woman through the windshield. There was something unusual about her. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded together as though she had spent a lifetime learning how to remain composed even when everything around her felt uncertain. Most people in difficult situations carried visible frustration or fear. She carried silence. Darnell turned off the ignition and looked at Lily. "Stay in the van for just a minute, sweetheart." Lily tilted her head. "Are you going to help her?" He smiled gently. "I'm going to see if she is all right." Lily nodded without another question. She had watched her father stop for strangers before. He always said that asking if someone was okay cost less than pretending not to notice them. Darnell picked up the warm paper bag and walked across the cracked sidewalk. The evening air had become even colder, carrying the sharp smell of winter and wet pavement. Charlotte heard footsteps approaching and instinctively lifted her head. She expected another person asking her to move along. Instead, she saw a tired man wearing a faded delivery jacket, with reflective stripes that had lost most of their shine. His work boots were worn. His face showed the kind of exhaustion that came from honest labor instead of sleepless worry. Yet his eyes remained calm. He stopped several feet away, careful not to invade her space. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "have you eaten today?" Charlotte almost answered with the truth that she had skipped breakfast by choice before beginning her experiment. But that felt like another life. She simply lowered her eyes and shook her head once. Darnell glanced at the paper bag in his hand before looking back at her. There was no dramatic pause, no struggle visible on his face. He simply sat down on the cold concrete a respectful distance away and placed the bag between them. "Chicken noodle soup," he said with a small smile. "It stays warm longer than most people think." Charlotte stared at the bag without touching it. "I cannot take your dinner." Darnell shrugged lightly. "Then we will both have some." Charlotte looked at him in confusion. "You do not even know me." "That is true," he replied. "But hunger introduces itself pretty quickly." For the first time that day, Charlotte felt the corner of her mouth move, not into a smile exactly, but into something close enough that she almost remembered what hope felt like. Darnell opened the paper bag, removed the soup container, another empty cup from his delivery van, and carefully divided the soup into 2 equal portions. Then he split the grilled cheese sandwich, placing one half beside each cup. He made certain her portion looked exactly like his. Not larger, not smaller, equal. Charlotte watched every movement in complete silence. She had attended charity banquets worth millions of dollars. She had watched photographers capture oversized donation checks beneath crystal chandeliers. None of those moments unsettled her as deeply as watching a man with almost nothing quietly refuse to make her feel like a burden. Across the street, Lily watched through the van window, smiling softly as though she had already known exactly what her father would do. Steam rose slowly from the paper cups, drifting into the cold evening air before disappearing. Between passing headlights, neither of them spoke for several moments. The city continued rushing around them, impatient as ever, while two strangers shared the quiet that seemed to exist outside of time. Charlotte wrapped both hands around the warm cup, letting the heat slowly return to her fingers. She had eaten in restaurants where a single dinner cost more than some families earned in a week, yet nothing she remembered tasted as honest as the first spoonful of simple chicken noodle soup. It was not the recipe that made the difference. It was the person who had offered it without asking for anything in return. "It is good," she said softly. Darnell smiled without looking at her. "Miss Linda owns the diner. She says soup is supposed to remind people that tomorrow is worth showing up for." Charlotte looked down at the cup again. "She sounds wise." "She is. She also makes sure nobody leaves hungry if she can help it." Charlotte swallowed another spoonful before asking the question that had quietly settled into her thoughts. "What if you needed this more than I did?" Darnell looked toward the old delivery van where Lily was still patiently waiting. Through the windshield, he could see her pretending to read while secretly watching them every few seconds. He smiled to himself. "Then I guess tomorrow we will eat something else." Charlotte followed his gaze and noticed the little girl for the first time. The child gave a shy wave from inside the van. Charlotte hesitated before returning it. Lily immediately smiled wider, as though that tiny exchange had somehow made the evening brighter. "Is she your daughter?" Charlotte asked. "She is my favorite person in the whole world," Darnell answered. There was no hesitation in his voice, no dramatic emotion, just quiet certainty. Charlotte lowered her eyes. "Does she know you gave away your dinner?" Darnell chuckled softly. "She probably suggested it before I did." Almost on cue, the van door opened. Lily carefully stepped onto the sidewalk, carrying a small knitted scarf folded across her arms. She walked toward them with the natural confidence children sometimes have when kindness feels more obvious than fear. "Hi," she said to Charlotte. "Daddy says soup tastes better when people share it." Charlotte smiled faintly. "Your father seems to know many important things." Lily shrugged. "He mostly remembers what Grandma used to tell him." She looked at Charlotte's hands. "You still look cold." Before Charlotte could respond, Lily gently held out the scarf. It was faded around the edges and clearly handmade years earlier. "You can borrow this until you get somewhere warm." Charlotte stared at the little scarf for several seconds. "Sweetheart, this belongs to you." Lily nodded. "I know. That is why it is warm." Something inside Charlotte shifted so quietly that she almost missed it. Board meetings had never silenced her. Billion-dollar negotiations had never unsettled her. Yet a child offering her favorite scarf without hesitation left her searching for words that refused to come. She carefully accepted it with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Lily simply smiled and stepped back beside her father. Darnell looked at his daughter with quiet pride before finishing the last spoonful of soup. The meal was gone. The warmth remained. Charlotte wrapped the scarf gently around her neck, unaware that for the first time in many years, she was not thinking about business, reputation, or success. She was thinking about two people who possessed almost nothing, yet somehow lived as though generosity could never run out. The paper cups sat empty beside them, but none of the three seemed in a hurry to leave. Sometimes the smallest moments lasted longer than the grandest occasions because nobody was trying to impress anyone. Charlotte gently folded the knitted scarf against her neck, feeling its uneven stitches beneath her fingertips. It was not expensive. It was not fashionable. Yet it carried something no luxury brand had ever managed to sew into fabric. It carried love that had been made by hand. She reached carefully into the inside pocket of her worn coat, where she had hidden a crisp $100 bill before beginning the experiment. It was supposed to be an emergency backup, something she promised herself she would never use. Now she quietly placed it between them. Please, she said. Take this. You have already done more than enough. Darnell looked at the bill without touching it. His expression did not change. He simply pushed it back toward her with 2 fingers. You should keep it. Charlotte frowned gently. You could buy groceries for your daughter. Maybe. Or fill your gas tank. Probably. Then why refuse it? Darnell leaned back against the brick wall and looked toward the evening sky where the last traces of daylight were fading behind gray clouds. Because I did not share dinner hoping it would become a business transaction. Charlotte stared at him in silence. Nobody had spoken to her that way in years. Not because the words were harsh. They were not. They were calm, honest, free from resentment. Darnell continued quietly. If you still need that money tomorrow, you will be glad you kept it. If you do not, maybe you will find someone else who does. Charlotte slowly lowered the bill into her pocket again. For the first time since leaving her office that morning, she felt embarrassed by how often she had believed money was the fastest answer to gratitude. Lily sat beside her father on the sidewalk, swinging her feet gently. Grandma used to say presents are nice, she said. But remembering people is even better. Charlotte smiled softly. Your grandmother sounds like someone I wish I had met. Lily nodded with complete confidence. You kind of did. Daddy still listens to her every day. Darnell laughed quietly. She made sure of that before I turned 18. The 3 of them shared another peaceful silence while cars continued passing only a few yards away. Nobody inside those vehicles knew that one simple meal had quietly changed the direction of someone's heart. Charlotte looked at Darnell once more. May I ask you something? Of course. Why did you stop for me? There were dozens of people who walked by. Darnell thought for only a moment. Because one winter, many years ago, somebody stopped for my mother when she thought nobody would. I was about Lily's age. I never learned that man's name. I just remember my mother crying after he left because he treated her like she mattered. His eyes rested on his daughter. People forget kindness longer than they remember money. I figured maybe tonight was my turn to pass it along. Charlotte lowered her gaze, unable to speak. The experiment she believed would reveal the character of strangers had quietly become a mirror, showing her everything wealth had never taught her. When they finally stood to leave, the sky had turned completely dark. The streetlights cast long golden reflections across the damp pavement, and the city seemed quieter than it had only an hour earlier. Charlotte carefully removed the knitted scarf from around her neck and held it toward Lily. I should give this back, she said softly. Lily shook her head before her father could speak. Keep it tonight. It is colder where you are going than where we are. Charlotte almost smiled at the innocent certainty in the little girl's voice. How do you know where I am going? Lily shrugged. I do not. But sometimes people are colder on the inside. Darnell glanced at his daughter with quiet surprise. That sounds like Grandma again. Lily nodded proudly. She said warm hearts help before warm blankets do. Charlotte felt her throat tighten. She carefully folded the scarf instead of handing it back. Then I will borrow it until tomorrow. Darnell stood and brushed the dust from his worn jeans. That sounds fair. Charlotte looked at the 2 of them for a long moment, trying to memorize faces she had only known for less than an hour. Thank you, she whispered again. Darnell simply nodded. Get somewhere warm. There was no request for her name, no curiosity about her past, no expectation that they would ever meet again. He opened the van door for Lily, waited until she climbed inside, then walked around to the driver's seat. Before starting the engine, Lily rolled down her window. Good night. Charlotte waved gently. Good night, sweetheart. The old delivery van disappeared into evening traffic, its faded taillights blending with hundreds of others until they became impossible to distinguish. Charlotte remained standing on the sidewalk for another minute, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of buses, distant train tracks, and hurried footsteps. Then she reached into the hidden pocket sewn inside her coat and quietly removed a slim black smartphone that nobody had seen all day. The screen lit up instantly. More than 80 missed calls, dozens of urgent text messages, security teams searching every neighborhood she had visited, executive assistants demanding updates, board members wondering why every scheduled meeting had been canceled without explanation. Charlotte ignored them all. Instead, she opened the security application connected to every hotel, restaurant, and property her company owned. She began reviewing footage from earlier that day. At the first hotel, she watched herself being turned away before reaching the lobby. At one cafe, an employee quietly pointed toward the exit before she had finished speaking. At another property, two staff members exchanged uncomfortable glances before pretending not to notice her standing outside in the cold. Nobody shouted. Nobody insulted her. Yet each quiet dismissal felt heavier than raised voices ever could. Charlotte leaned against the brick wall, replaying the videos one after another. Every building carried her company's name. Every employee wore uniforms she had personally approved. Every handbook spoke proudly about dignity, hospitality, and compassion. Yet the only genuine hospitality she had received all day came from a tired black single father whose wallet held barely enough for tomorrow's gas, and a little girl who believed a handmade scarf belonged around the neck of someone colder than herself. Charlotte slowly closed the application. The city lights reflected across the dark screen, and for the first time since becoming chief executive officer, she wondered whether she had spent years building beautiful buildings while forgetting to build the kind of culture that allowed kindness to survive inside them. Charlotte did not return to her penthouse that night. Instead, she asked her driver to take her to the corporate headquarters after every office light had gone dark. The building stood exactly as she had left it that morning, 50 stories of polished glass reflecting the Chicago skyline, elegant, impressive, and strangely quiet. She entered through the employee entrance instead of the executive lobby. The overnight custodian looked up from his work and smiled politely, without recognizing the woman beneath the plain coat. "Long day?" he asked. Charlotte nodded. "Longer than I expected." He smiled kindly. "Tomorrow is another chance." The word stayed with her as she rode the elevator alone. Her office felt different somehow. The walls had not changed. The furniture remained exactly where it had always been. Awards still lined the shelves. Framed magazine covers still celebrated her success. Yet none of them seemed to matter as much as the faded scarf folded carefully across her desk. She picked it up with both hands and ran her fingers over the uneven stitches once more. Someone had spent hours making this for a little girl they loved. Tonight, that little girl had handed it away without hesitation. Charlotte sat in silence before opening her laptop. Instead of reviewing financial reports, she opened customer complaints from the past 12 months. Then employee feedback. Then anonymous surveys from hourly workers. A pattern slowly emerged. Guests wearing expensive suits described outstanding service. Families who looked less fortunate often described feeling invisible. Some mentioned being watched more closely than other guests. Others wrote that nobody greeted them at all. None of the incidents seemed dramatic enough to make national headlines. Together, however, they painted a picture Charlotte could no longer ignore. Hospitality had quietly become selective. She leaned back and closed her eyes. The company had perfected luxury while slowly forgetting humanity. Across town, Darnell and Lily finished washing their 2 soup cups before bedtime. Lily carefully placed the clean bowls upside down on the drying rack. "Do you think she found somewhere warm?" she asked. Darnell smiled as he tucked another blanket around her shoulders on the old couch where they usually read together before bed. "I hope so." Lily looked thoughtful. She looked lonely. Darnell nodded slowly. Sometimes people who have the most around them still carry the biggest empty spaces inside. Lily rested her head against his shoulder. "Can we pray that she has a better tomorrow?" "Of course." They bowed their heads together in the quiet apartment. Darnell did not ask for money, promotions, or easier days. He simply hoped the stranger they had met would find kindness wherever she woke up next. Miles away, Charlotte's phone rang again. This time it was her chief operating officer. She answered at last. "Charlotte, everyone has been searching for you. Are you all right?" She looked through the office window at the sleeping city below. "I am now." There was a long pause before she continued. "Cancel tomorrow morning's investor breakfast. That meeting has been scheduled for months." "I know." Her voice remained calm. "Schedule every regional manager instead. 8 o'clock. Mandatory attendance. No exceptions." Her executive hesitated. "May I ask what this is about?" Charlotte looked once more at the small knitted scarf resting across her desk. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "we are going to remember what our business was supposed to stand for." She ended the call, switched off the lights in her office, and walked out carrying nothing except the scarf, knowing that by sunrise the company would begin changing. Even though the man who had inspired that change had already gone to sleep believing he had simply shared dinner with a stranger. The next morning arrived with clear skies and the sharp brightness that often followed a cold Chicago night. Darnell woke before sunrise as he always did. He brewed a pot of black coffee, packed Lily's lunch with careful attention, and folded the small note he slipped into her lunchbox every Friday. This morning it read, "Never let the world convince you that kindness is weakness. Love, Dad." Lily smiled when she found it, but tucked it away without reading it aloud. Some things belonged only between a father and his daughter. After dropping her off at school, Darnell began another long shift, expecting nothing more than traffic, deliveries, and another ordinary day. Across the city, however, something entirely different was unfolding. Every regional manager from Charlotte's company sat silently inside the executive conference room. The atmosphere felt heavier than any quarterly earnings meeting. Charlotte entered wearing her usual tailored suit, but instead of carrying financial reports, she placed a faded knitted scarf in the center of the polished conference table. Nobody recognized it. She looked around the room before speaking. "Yesterday, I visited several of our properties without anyone knowing who I was." Curious expressions spread across the room. One executive attempted a nervous smile. Was this some kind of audit? Charlotte nodded slowly. It became one. She described the entire day without raising her voice. The hotel entrance where she had been quietly turned away. The cafe where nobody acknowledged her. The restaurant where employees looked through her instead of at her. She did not accuse anyone. She simply described what it felt like to disappear while standing in buildings that proudly displayed her family name. The room remained completely silent. Then Charlotte lifted the scarf from the table. "This," she said softly, "was given to me by the daughter of a man who had every reason to keep it for herself." She paused before continuing. "He shared his dinner with a stranger because he believed people should never eat alone if he could help it. Neither of them knew who I was. They only knew who they wanted to be." Several managers lowered their eyes. Charlotte looked around the table one final time. "Beginning today, every employee from every property will complete new hospitality training. Not about luxury, about dignity. If someone walks through our doors wearing worn shoes instead of polished ones, they will receive the same welcome as the guest arriving in a limousine." One manager quietly asked, "What inspired this change?" Charlotte smiled faintly. "Someone who has never attended business school." At nearly the same moment, Darnell finished a delivery outside a neighborhood community center. As he climbed back into his van, he noticed an unfamiliar black Rolls-Royce turning slowly onto his street before continuing past him toward the apartment complex where he lived. He barely gave it a second thought. Luxury cars occasionally passed through the neighborhood on their way downtown. Yet, when he returned home that evening to pick up Lily, several neighbors stood outside their building whispering with quiet excitement. The elegant sedan remained parked at the curb, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon sun. A professional driver stood beside the rear passenger door with calm patience. Darnell slowed his steps, confused but untroubled. Lily squeezed his hand and looked up at him. "Daddy," she whispered, "do you think somebody got lost?" Before Darnell could answer, the rear door opened slowly, and a familiar pair of gentle blue eyes met his across the sidewalk. Charlotte stepped out of the Rolls-Royce without the expensive coat she usually wore to public events. She carried only the faded knitted scarf folded carefully across her arms. For a moment, nobody spoke. Darnell recognized her face first, not from the night before, but from newspaper articles he had occasionally glanced at while waiting for deliveries. Lily looked from the elegant car to the woman, then back to her father. Charlotte walked toward them slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. "Good afternoon," she said quietly. Darnell nodded politely. "Good afternoon." She held out the scarf. "I promised I would return this." Lily accepted it with a bright smile. "I knew you would." Charlotte looked at the little girl before meeting Darnell's eyes again. "Yesterday, I was not honest with you." Darnell remained calm. "You do not owe me an explanation." Charlotte shook her head gently. "Maybe not, but you deserve one." She told them everything. The experiment, the disguise, the hotels, the restaurants, the long day spent discovering how easily people could become invisible. She admitted that she owned the very buildings that had turned her away. She admitted that the meal they had shared had changed more than her evening. It had changed the way she understood success itself. When she finished speaking, the sidewalk grew quiet once more. Several curious neighbors watched from nearby porches, expecting surprise or excitement. Darnell simply listened. Finally, he smiled. The same calm smile she remembered from the night before. Sounds like you had a difficult day. Charlotte almost laughed through the emotion gathering in her eyes. That is all you are going to say? He shrugged gently. Yesterday you were hungry. Today you are not. I am glad things worked out. Charlotte lowered her head for a brief moment. There was no resentment in his voice. No attempt to remind her who she was. No interest in being rewarded. Only relief that another person was doing better than before. She took a slow breath. I came because I wanted to thank you. I also wanted to ask something. Darnell waited patiently. I am creating a new community hospitality initiative across every one of my hotels. Free evening meals for anyone in need. Employee training centered on dignity instead of appearances. Partnerships with neighborhood organizations. She paused before continuing. I would like you to help me build it. Darnell looked genuinely surprised. I am not a business executive. No, Charlotte answered softly. You are something much harder to find. He glanced down at Lily, who squeezed his hand with quiet encouragement. What exactly would you need from me? Charlotte smiled for the first time since arriving. Teach us how to see people before we see circumstances. Darnell stood silently for a moment before giving a small nod. If it helps families feel welcome, I will do everything I can. Charlotte extended her hand. He shook it with the same quiet respect he had shown her when he believed she had nothing. The neighbors began smiling among themselves as Lily slipped her small hand into Charlotte's free hand without hesitation. The little girl looked up and asked, Does this mean more people will get soup? Charlotte smiled warmly. Yes, sweetheart. A lot more people. Lily grinned. Grandma would like that. Charlotte looked toward Darnell. She must have been an extraordinary woman. He nodded once. She believed kindness should travel farther than money because it lasts longer. Charlotte glanced across the neighborhood, where ordinary families were returning home after ordinary days, and realized the greatest investment she would ever make had nothing to do with buildings or balance sheets. It began with one father, one little girl, one shared meal, and the quiet courage to treat a stranger like she mattered before knowing anything about her at all.